Hi guys, Nick here from Conservation Careers and welcome to the podcast. Now, have you ever felt like escaping the rat race and travelling the world? Seeking impact, adventure and new experiences, perhaps volunteering for nature conservation organisations and setting yourself up for a career change or education when you return. But with the world as your playground, where do you start? How do you plan such a trip to ensure your time and money are well spent? Well, today we're speaking with Julia Rogers, who's founder of EnRoute Consulting. Now, as a professional Gap Year Counsellor, and that's a new job title to me, Julia prides herself in understanding the complicated process of planning a meaningful experience whilst travelling. Now, during this episode, we discuss the value of gap years or career breaks and what they can bring to people in terms of their work, their education, and their lives. We talk about the different types of experiences people can discover and how to plan for a successful trip. And finally, we also chat about how a Gap Year Counsellor can help you if you need support. It's a globe-trotting, experience-seeking, life-changing episode. Enjoy.
Well, thanks for having me, Nick. And my name is Julia Rogers. I'm based in Stowe, Vermont, USA, and I'm a professional Gap Year Counselor, and I own my own business. It's called EnRoute Consulting, and I've been Gap Year Counseling for 15 years.
And that is so cool. I mean, I've mentioned just before the chat, I've never met a Gap Year Counsellor before. And 25 years ago, I did a gap year myself and found it like life-changing. It really kind of showed me what's out there in the world. And I kind of wish I had a counsellor back in the day to kind of walk me through the kind of key questions, the key steps to take to make sure that I got the most out of that experience. I mean, I tried on my own, but I to understand that there are these things, these people called Gap Year Counsellors out there who can help. I find it really fascinating. So, yeah, thank you for joining the podcast. Really kind of good to reconnect, Julia, and talk through your work. Where to start? I think to start is thinking about and explain what is a gap year, and also from our audience perspective, we're talking about people who are interested in wildlife conservationists, so they're aspirational or professional conservationists. They often go on experiences abroad, internships, volunteerships, that sort of stuff. So can we just sort of start with just painting a bit of a picture of what is a gap year? What does an experience look like? What things can people do? And perhaps why do people take gap year experiences?
Of course. And I think it is kind of ironic that I'm going to be telling the definition of a gap year to someone who is from the island where gap years kind of, formed.
Oh, is that right? Came from the UK, right?
Yeah. I think that's kind of, if we're going to go back to the origins of gap time, it really did start in the UK and Europe as this kind of rite of passage. I mean, it goes even further back with walkabouts that Aboriginals took, and this idea of a young adult going out into the world and meeting new people and kind of exploring and then coming back to their community changed. Right. And so that idea really did originate, I think, kind of mid-century, last century with the hippie trains and kind of the backpacking Europe and all of those kinds of experiences that people didn't necessarily start labeling gap year until a little bit more recently. But it definitely is more of a British concept, a European concept. It's very common in Australia, New Zealand. The terminology is much more common there. So Americans started co-opting this term probably 20 years ago. But it's only been in maybe the past decade where it's really been picking up steam stateside. And so I think that one thing that's interesting when we're talking about definitions of gap year is that it is a little bit different, both when we're talking about it from the American perspective versus maybe the traditional European and British perspective. Mm-hmm. So when I'm talking about gap years to people who are potentially going to take them, I define it as a intentional period of time where you're really focused on personal growth and exploration, specifically tied to experiential learning. So you're outside of the classroom, you're pushing your comfort zone, but you're also moving through this period of time intentionally. So it's not the absence of a choice, it's an active choice that you're opting into. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the kind of framework that when we talk about gap time, we're talking about. And before I kind of start rambling on, do you have any clarifying questions?
Yeah, no, I love that. I hadn't actually sort of appreciated the kind of looping back to sort of like an Aboriginal rites of passage. I guess in lots of cultures you have that, like young boys becoming men almost, or girls becoming women, and sort of going off and finding their independence, finding themselves, for want of a better word. And yeah, it sort of connects to a much higher purpose when you think about it like that, really. People talk about finding themselves, which feels a bit kind of hippie woo-woo, but yeah, I guess that's part of it, isn't it? It's about becoming an adult, finding yourself, and there must be different intentions.
Exactly. Yeah. And when we talk about really a meaningful gap period, and it doesn't have to be when you are a young adult, although that is a really wonderful time to take it. But gap time is really, if you think about it as a bridge, ironically
Yeah.
with the word gap, but I think of it as a bridge between life points. So a natural time to take gap year is after, high school or secondary education and before higher education,
Yeah.
or between higher education and grad school or the workforce. Or if you're switching jobs mid-career, you might take gap time. Or if you are bridging into retirement, you might take a gap year. So
Yeah.
there's nothing to say that you can't take gap time at any point in life, which is, I think, very empowering to know. But it does have these. I think that a good gap year touches on three things: personal, practical, and professional growth.
Hmm.
So the personal stuff is the things, the hobbies you want to deepen, the interests you have, the things that you want to do just for your own enrichment. The practical goals are the things that are kind of these life skills or experiences that you're going to have that are kind of increasing your ability to move through the world as an adult. And then the pre-professional or professional goals are going to be that career exploration stuff, which I feel like for your listeners is kind of the bread and butter of this conversation. But certainly those other 2 points are really important when you're thinking about crafting kind of a really full gap year experience.
Yeah. And I was wondering if you can just sort of talk to the feeling of like a shift in perspective, I think, that we all get when we travel. It's very easy for
Yeah.
me to sit here behind my desk day to day and do my work, think about my work and what I want to do and that sort of stuff. And we all have those sorts of times. But when I'm abroad and I'm away from all this and I have a bit of a break, and actually Christmas is a good time for that. I've not worked for maybe a
Mm.
couple of weeks, and had a bit of time to kind of think and stand back. And I think travel gives you that opportunity just to kind of reflect a bit more deeply and to see things from I guess a different perspective, a different angle.
Oh,
Yeah.
for
And
sure.
and that I guess feeds into the whole purpose of a gap year and yeah, why people are out there doing it.
Yeah, I think that something kind of magical happens when we get outside of our normal bubble.
Yeah.
And it's especially effective when you are younger because young adult brains are more psychologically flexible, is kind of the technical term. So when you are going and experiencing other cultures, other ways of living, when you're learning new skills like a language, for example, your brain is kind of sucking that all in. And it's reorganizing your value system. It's helping you understand the world beyond yourself. It's helping you be more empathetic and compassionate. And that feeds into how you build your life. So
Mm.
I think that when I talk to students who've taken gap time, I know for myself, I also took a gap year when I was young. It completely has set the stage for how I view myself as an adult, for my values, for even some of the things I appreciate as a result of my gap time.
Mm, yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Um, so when people think about gap years, like what are the different types of things that people can do? You've kind of touched on professional and
Mm.
personal and other goals, but can you sort of just paint some examples of the sorts of actual projects or experiences that people that you support, people that you know that go through this experience, like today, can kind of get involved with? Just gives a bit of a kind of a selection
Oh, for
box.
sure. Yeah, I mean, it's really exciting. I don't want anyone listening to feel overwhelmed when you start discovering how many things you can do with gap time,
Right.
which is why we have the goal setting process. That's why you start thinking about what do you want to do versus what's just out there. But I would say when you're thinking about the types of opportunities you can pursue, there's kind of these two umbrella categories that I like to subdivide things into. There's structured or programmatic opportunities, and there's self-designed opportunities.
Hmm.
And so when we talk about a lot of the things that you can do for conservation work, those are going to be more programmatic. So when we talk about volunteer opportunities, where conservation volunteering, field work, those kinds of things, internships,
Yeah.
courses, experiential semesters, which are especially popular with younger gappers, which those are a little bit more structured and mentored experiences where you're literally traveling with a group of peers and
Mhm.
doing different types of service work or different types of outdoor exploration or cultural learning. And then there's also national service, which many countries have. We have a very strong national service arm in the States, and I know that you all do too.
That's
So
VSO, is that right? Voluntary Services. Yeah.
exactly. Yep. And ours is called AmeriCorps.
Right.
And I think Canadians have their own and et cetera. So, those are all programmatic experiences where there's some structural support. You sometimes will pay a fee to opt into those things, even if it's volunteering or interning.
Yeah.
But in return, you get, room and board, you get mentorship, you get learning experiences, you have a structure to your days.
Yeah.
The other side over here is self-designed opportunities. And so those are going to be things that are these more traditionally build on your own experiences like independent travel, woofing or workaways. Those are where you go and do a work exchange in exchange for room and board. Destination work, where maybe you get a working holiday visa and go to Australia and work for a year. So those types of experiences are kind of DIY, if you will. So they're not programmatic. You just do it on your own, and you build that own experience.
Right, yeah. And actually, it was woofing that I did, back in the
Yeah.
day when I was in Australia. I was backpacking just briefly, with some friends, and then we separated. And I was at a hostel and just picked up a book about woofing, and then went off and did a couple of woofing experiences. It's Willing Workers on Organic Farms is what that stands for. So you go and do
Yeah,
half a
they've
day's
now
work.
changed the name. It's now Worldwide Opportunities. I think that the willing workers thing tripped up some visa stuff, so now they call it Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. And then there's another one called Workaway, which is also widely utilized. I've
Interesting.
also done it. It's amazing. It's such a cool experience, and it's so cost effective too.
Yeah, so you do half a day's work. This might have changed, and in return, you get your food and lodging. And what was
Yeah.
amazing for me was that rather than just transiently sort of traveling through places for me, I stopped in a place for a week or two, got to know the
Mm-hmm.
place, the people, and felt like I was doing something worthwhile rather than sort of passively
Definitely.
going from A to B to C, And by far, the whole trip for 6, 12 months, whatever it was, those were the times I actually enjoyed the most, was the kind of the giving back, the volunteering elements. And yeah, it's interesting. There's lots of those different options that are out there for people.
Oh,
What
definitely.
what are some of the benefits you see of people that go through an experience? You've talked a little bit about the objectives, but what do people get out
Mm.
of it? Like when they come back home, when they either go back into university or whatever that might be, higher education, or whether they go into the workforce. Like I think there must be an inherent concern about I'm hitting pause for like 12 months a year or a month or whatever it might be. There's different durations you choose. Um, but is that time? I'm not earning in that year, probably not very much. I'm not formally educating myself at university. I'm not in my career. I'm not working up a career ladder. There's going to be anxiety about that year and was it well spent? I mean, how do the scales tip in terms of the actual benefits that people get out of that tangibly they bring with them into their life, their career when they get
Mm.
back?
Ooh, there's so much in there, Nick, that I want to
Yeah,
untangle because I think that, and this is a truism, I think, of many of our Western cultures' mindsets, is that productivity
yeah.
is the goal of life, especially young life, because we've trained our young people to kind of do as well as you can in secondary school so you can get into the best uni that you can so that you can go into the workforce as soon as possible. To what end?
Yeah.
I think that when we think about gap time, it's really about slowing down and saying, not what do I want to be, but who do I want to be?
Mm,
How do I want to move through this world? What are my, what do I value? How do I want to spend my time? What environment do I want to find myself in when I actually do start my career or when I restart my career? And so when we talk about the benefits of gap time, there are some academic and intellectual benefits that come with it that I can touch on, but a lot of it is this internal learning how you want to be in the world.
mm,
And so students who take gap time, when we've done surveys, we found just overwhelmingly positive results when people are self-selecting what they've gotten out of their gap time.
mm,
For example, in a recent survey from 2020, over 3,000 Americans were surveyed in this particular survey, and 98% of them said that they came out of it more confident and more mature as a result of their gap experiences.
mm,
95% of them said that they felt more well set up for their next stage in life as a result of their gap time. 84% said that they increased their academic motivation as a result of their gap time. So actually stepping away from the classroom environment helped them reinvigorate and re-energize their curiosity and capacity to learn. And that is something that we see in American universities, is that gap year students tend to have higher GPAs than traditional students. They graduate sooner than traditional students. And for us, with university being so expensive in the States, that is a huge benefit to
mm.
really kind of starting college or restarting college with much more intention and understanding of why you're there, what you're interested in, what you're not interested in. And that's a big gift of gap time. If you think you want to be a wildlife biologist, get into the field and start doing some research and data collection and data analyzing, because that will teach you very quickly if that is the type of work that you are suited for. And I can't tell you how many students I've worked with who have tried out those things and kind of confirmed or denied a particular career path that they thought they wanted to do because of the experiences that they have in real life doing those things.
Yeah. And I think I love that, like either confirm or denied. Like, I think even learning that you don't like something is just as valuable, if not more valuable, than learning that you
Yeah.
did want to do that thing, isn't it? You know,
Mm.
it's a good lesson to learn it early, and then move on to whatever the next thing might be.
Yeah. And also, some students have to learn that it's okay not to know.
Yeah.
I think that we also put a lot of pressure on young people to have a sense of what they want to do very early on, especially, with the UK educational system, how it's tracked, and you kind of opt into certain tracks pretty young in life.
Yeah.
I think it's the same in the States, where there's just, what do you want to be when you grow up? That's a common question that we ask our young people, not like, what are you curious about? Or what's your favorite course right now? Which I think we need to start readjusting how we phrase things with young people to take that pressure off. Because if you ask any adult what their career path looked like, it's a wiggly line. It's not this like straight this, then this, then this. And I knew exactly where I was going the whole time. So I think that taking that pressure off young people to know exactly what they're doing, and say instead, make the best decisions you can at the moment. Do what's exciting and interesting to you, and you will move forward accordingly. If you have this kind of like shorter term vision of what you want to pursue.
Yeah. And again, that's where the gap year, I think, comes in. Because you're right. I mean, so many of us, we choose here in the UK, we call them GCSEs, like when you're sort of 16 years old, you take a series of tests, and they then predetermine the next level if you want to go into it, the A level,
Right.
3 or 4 maybe. And then they then predetermine whether you want to go to university and which one that might be. And then they determine which job you might be. And it's really focusing in, like you're choosing this at maybe 15 years old earlier, what direction you're taking. And before you know it, you've been on a treadmill and you went into a career and maybe it's not quite right for you. Maybe you didn't really like assess and look around fully, or take time to reflect, or take those small steps about value and where you want to go. And yeah, that's such a big part, isn't it? It's just hitting
Mm.
pause on that conveyor belt, and just
Yeah.
saying, okay, do I want to rejoin or do I want to go in a different direction? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And also realizing that it's not this time off. You're not just going to be like sipping pina coladas on the beach for a year. You
Really? Ah,
are
I'm
you
out.
I know, right? Darn. You can take a weekend to do that here and there.
Yeah.
But like, this period of time is so integral to forming who you want to be. I already said that, but I think that that is like such an important point, that it is not a stagnation. It is this exponential personal growth that happens,
Yeah.
and world expansion, which is, I think, completely priceless when it comes to one's trajectory in life.
Yeah, I love it. Well, let's talk about the practical steps then. If we sort of wetted someone's whistle and they're interested and have been thinking about it, or it's the new year, it's a time when a lot of people are thinking about making a
Sure.
shift, a change, planning trips, planning
Mm-hmm.
vacations. Like, obviously, you do this as a professional, you support people, and we'll talk about how a counselor works in a minute as well, like specifically. But if someone to do this on their own, and let's say they are thinking about like a wildlife conservation experience,
Mm.
however long that might be, like, where should they start? Because we have literally a world of opportunity in front of us. It's daunting, isn't it? Like, what process would you recommend people follow? And have you got any really good hints and tips to kind of break it down and make it quite actionable for people?
Oh, for sure. I've got all sorts of alliterative stuff to share. We already had the 3 Ps, the personal, practical, and
Ooh,
professional. But, I think that when it comes to starting your planning process, there's 3 Ds: dream, define, and design.
mm,
So when you're listening to this podcast and you're starting to think, oh, wow, I really want to take gap time, that's you want to enter the dream phase. And this is where you think big. You don't worry about your budget yet. Don't worry about what's practical. Just think about what would be so interesting and exciting that you are willing to get off that conveyor belt and take some time for this kind of adventure. And then once you kind of have brainstormed a little bit, and that brainstorming process could be pen and paper,
yeah,
you could be having a notes app on your phone. Some
yeah,
people like to dream board, where they're literally cutting stuff out of magazines and putting it on something
yeah,
visual. So whatever
yeah,
that process looks like for you, start that process. And then you want to move into that defining stage. And that's really where you start to get a little bit more practical, where you say, okay, what are those goals of mine, my personal goals of what I want to get out of this period of time? What is the time frame that we're talking about here? Because a gap year, as we
yeah,
define it, doesn't have to actually be a year. It could be 3 months, it could be 10 months, it could be 18 months. So thinking about what's practical for you in your situation is important. And then also your budget, and thinking about like, how much do you have to invest in this period of time, and what do you have to do to set yourself up to financially be able to take some time out.
yeah.
So that those 3 components are really important during this defining stage.
Yeah.
And then you have a framework to start researching from, and that's the design stage. So that's when you start going on, your website and start looking at options, and you start thinking about the geography of where you want to go. And if you want to, I mean, especially with people who are interested in conservation work, you can usually say like, oh, well, I love the ocean and I love, oceanography and I love marine conservation. So that can kind of send you in a certain direction as far as the type of field work or conservation experience you could want. Whereas other people have always wanted to engage with like the flora and fauna of Africa, whereas other people want to go to the rainforest. So I think that it's a little bit easier almost for outdoorsy and conservation minded people, because there's probably some nature documentary you saw as a child that's going to call you to a certain location. And that's a great way to start your actual research and finding the right types of programs and opportunities that are going to really maximize that period of time for you.
Yeah, I love that. But coming in with clarity about what you're looking for before you start looking is what I heard
Before
from
you
that.
start researching, because the fact of the matter is there are so many cool experiences out there.
Yeah,
You could throw a dart at a wall and hit a really interesting opportunity,
yeah,
but that doesn't mean it's the right opportunity for you.
yeah,
So start with your own personal anchors or goals, and then move on to kind of look researching from a place of intention, like you just said. Yeah.
yeah. I love it. Yeah. It reminds me of the process of Walt Disney when he used to create cartoons. They had two rooms. You might have heard this. He had a dream room, and I think he called it a nightmare room. I might be wrong on that one. But he took all his creative staff into the dream room, and in that room, brainstorming area, every idea goes. You're not allowed to be negative on it, and one idea can spawn another. Just let it go. Get it all out. Get your mood board out. Really be creative and be positive and be encouraging. Don't question or criticize ideas. Then they took all those ideas and moved them across into the nightmare room, and then they shot as many down as possible. And the ones that were still left standing at the end of it were the good ideas.
Wow.
And I think
That is,
separating the kind of
yeah.
creation from what you're calling design and like the
Mm-hmm.
reality check,
Yeah.
actually creates, it really kind of goes wide and then goes shallow and then realistic, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that the other side of it too is the ethics and sustainability piece of whatever projects you're choosing, and
Right.
making sure that, especially if you're going to be volunteering or interning, is thinking deeply about the types of projects you're choosing, and making sure that you're doing your due diligence to ensure that whatever mission you're supporting is a worthwhile, sustainable, and ethically run mission.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And I mean, it is, I think I'm right in saying it's a booming industry, isn't it? Like, gap year providers, experience providers. It feels from my angle that it's a growing market, that there are more people entering, more opportunities. COVID was tough for sure a couple of years ago, but I feel a rebound and I'm sure it'll keep going that way. When you have any market like that, there are kind of the good guys and there are the bad guys. Let's say, what sort of questions and due diligence should people do when they're looking at someone? Let's say they have two opportunities in front of them or one opportunity. Like practically, how should someone check and validate that they're going to go to a good project? It's well run, health and safety is being well catered for, and so on. You're like, what sort of things should people bear in mind?
oh yeah. Well, there's definitely some red flags, especially
Yeah.
when it comes to working with animals.
Yep.
And I'm not a foremost expert on ethical animal engagement, but I do have some benchmarks that I always look for. And one easy one is that if you go to a website and you see a person with their arm slung around a large cat or any other animal that would in any other situation eat you, that is a red flag. If you are engaging in any kind of wildlife conservation or animal rehab work, there should be a very strong hands-off policy when it comes to working with wildlife. So a true wildlife rehab center is not going to have a lot of interaction with any animal that is going to be re-released back into the wild. Some sanctuaries have, animals that are bound to the sanctuary for whatever reason. Sometimes there's a little bit more interaction with those animals, like some small monkeys or other types of animals that are not dangerous. But you really want to be aware of if the sanctuary or organization is serving volunteers more than the animals that are there.
Yeah.
That is a big red flag. And so you really want to look at the language on a website and see who are they serving. And a good animal placement would be serving the animals first and foremost. The volunteer experience is meant to serve those animals. So that is one, thing to look for when you're looking at wildlife experiences.
Yeah.
When it comes to field work, one thing that I really look for, and the only reason I know so much about this side of things, is that my husband is a wildlife biologist. So whenever I have questions, I'm, pulling him over and saying, what do you think about this? When you're these organizations sometimes are going to a field research station or an organization that's working with governmental organizations and things like that. But you do want to see what kinds of things are they publishing? How is this data being used in the real world for practical conservation policies and outcomes?
Yeah.
So that is something that a good organization will have published on their website. They'll say, these are peer reviewed papers that have come out of our research, or this is how the Costa Rican government is using our data collection and those kinds of things. So I think that's another really good thing to look for when you're looking for conservation projects. How'd I do, Nick?
Very good. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to talk more generally too about when people are looking from a conservation perspective. I love that. And I think linked to what you said there at the end about how people use data and the example of the Costa Rican government, and so on. I would encourage people to look to see who they're partnering with as well. That's really, I think no good organization kind of works on their own. Really good organizations, they have local partners, country partners, and so on. They share data, they collaborate. That's a good sign. If someone's just doing something on their own and don't seem to be collaborating and sharing, there's a bit of a question mark about how useful that operation is from a conservation impact perspective.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. And usually they'll have in the banner on the bottom of their website, if they have a lot of partners, they usually like to brag about it. So it's usually easy to find that. Yeah,
rightly so. Yeah, absolutely. Great. Cost, money. It's another thing we've not touched upon. How much should people budget? I mean, I know how long's a piece of string, we'd say over here. It could be a small budget, a large budget. How much typically are people spending on an experience, or should they allocate for an experience, a gap year? And are there kind of funding, scholarship, bursary options? How can people make it cost effective if funding is a struggle?
At the beginning of this conversation, you said there were not going to be any gotcha questions.
Oh,
and this is
sorry.
A gotcha. No, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't say it's a gotcha question. It's just a very complicated question in some ways. But it's actually, I can break it down to help people understand. Really, when you're thinking about like the investment of a gap experience, a lot of it depends on where you are in your life stage. I know that your particular website serves a lot of different ages. So, if you are a pre-university 17 or 18-year-old, what you should expect to invest in gap time is going to look a lot different than if you're 25 or 35 years old and doing something as a professional that has a skill set already. So that is one thing to think about, is that if you have already invested some in your career and you have skills to share, then what you can expect to spend will be less than someone who is looking to gain those skills. And that is a worthwhile thing to distinguish, because it is, I think, an incredible investment in yourself to pay for some programs that have a really high quality experience that's going to affect your career path moving forward. So that being said, a lot of different places have different price points. So if we're focusing kind of on the conservation world, there are some really great grassroots, field research stations or conservation projects where you can go in and have a pretty low cost of living, maybe a few $100s or $1,000 a month just to kind of cover your own expenses. And then they are going to kind of push, get you right in to some of that research that's happening. You're going to be following around the researchers or PhD students that are on site. Whereas there are more programs that are a little bit more training focused or training forward. And so those ones that could be, $1,000 to $2,000 to $3,000 a month, but you're also maybe getting certifications as part of that program or training from people who are experts. So I would say that it really depends on the length of time that you're talking about as far as what your budget could look like, but and also where you're going in the world. But I would say that anywhere from, a few $100s a month to a few $1,000s a month would be like something to kind of just start wrapping your head around as far as budgeting.
Yeah, I think that's really useful. Yeah, and it was a tricky question. I apologize for that, but
no problem.
Yeah, you've answered that brilliantly. You touch on a really key point there as well about how there are lots of different types of experience in terms of the value that you gain as the volunteer or the intern, or however you kind of describe yourself. Yeah, some are like training programs. You get a solid accredited qualification at the end of that, whereas others are more experiential in a very different way. So the value you give and the value you get back is the two sides to scales there, really. And and everyone approaches that differently to make sure they get the right value back out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, but I didn't answer your question about fundraising or
Yeah.
how to actually make it work. And I would say that, you know, a great way of being able to fund conservation work is if you are attached to a university already and can
Mm.
get some money from the uni to do
Yep.
research or to go partner with someone who's already doing something interesting in the field or something along those lines. So that's a really good thing to pursue. A lot of colleges and universities have their own funding mechanisms to
Yep.
support scientists. If you are American, you know, the National Science Foundation and other granting organizations are a great route if you want to start your own research. For gap year students who are pre-college, there's not as many of those kind of governmental or university-based funding sources, but there are independent, you know, organizational-based funding sources. So sometimes if you go to an organization, they have their own scholarship program. And you can kind of inquire through that. Or you can also sometimes fundraise or like save up for your program fee to offset it once you're actually traveling.
Yeah. Great points. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, my wife did get a scholarship from her university back in the day to do a gap year type project. And also, it's worth saying, like at universities, lots of departments, research groups will have connections to other organizations, research stations, groups abroad, and they might be able to help
Yeah,
facilitate that travel, with their contacts. Yeah, yeah. It puts you in a
exactly.
good place actually when you need to do that. Yeah.
Hmm.
So you're a gap year counselor. As I said at the top, I hadn't really heard about this before, but I can really see how having someone help you through a process like this can be really beneficial. So, can you just talk me through like how you work as a gap year counselor? If I were to come to you and say, I want to do a gap year, I'm interested in turtles, whatever, I don't mind.
Right.
Yeah, what steps do you go through? How do you work? What does the relationship look like?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that one of the reasons why there's not a lot of us is that a lot of us being gap year counselors, professional gap year counselors, that this is a burgeoning industry. And, you know, it is still, it's not the most common option in the States, although it is growing.
Yeah.
Whereas I think, you know, in the UK and Europe, people were just like, well, your dad or granddad did a gap year or someone was in the army and we have connections still in India and go off and do your thing. So there was a different mindset about it. Whereas Americans, we love our specialists. And so, that's really where I come in. And a lot of times parents especially, they want their kid to be as safe as possible and to have a year that's as meaningful as possible, but they don't want to plan it. They don't want to be that person who's advising their own kid, and the kid doesn't want that either. The student wants to fledge. And so really where I come in is as this kind of third party mentor. And so that mentoring piece is a huge part of what I do, in addition to kind of the knowledge base and the travel experience that I have myself. So when students come to me and a family comes to me, it all starts with an exploratory conversation, which anybody is entitled to. You can, find me on my website if you're interested in chatting. And we kind of just talk through the generalities like this of what could a gap year look like for you based on your interest in turtles. You could go to Costa Rica, you could go to Bali, you could go to Australia. There's tons of really cool opportunities to kind of engage with, especially, sea turtles or tortoises, land tortoises as
Yeah.
well. So what kind of, turtle or tortoise are you interested in? But so that's through that exploratory process, we start making goals and anchors and kind of thinking about what is this year going to be about for this individual. And then I start showing them menus of options. So that are
That's almost
pre-vetted.
like, is that the dream piece you just gone through? Have I just captured
Yeah,
through these? Yeah.
the dream piece is a quick process with
Yeah.
me. So
Yeah.
usually that exploratory process is a bit more dreamy. And
Yeah.
then once a student like commits and we start working together, then we're getting right down to goal setting and kind of
Okay.
getting down to brass tacks.
Yeah.
And I use those goals to show them options.
Yeah.
So on the back end, I'm vetting options myself. I'm visiting different programs on site. I've created a database of my own of opportunities that I know and trust and have relationships with.
Mm-hmm.
That is only there's no financial relationship with any program that I recommend. It's all based on merit.
Mm-hmm.
So when a student says, oh, I'm interested in these types of conservation work or I'm open to woofing and things like that, we'll start looking at these different options and getting feedback and kind of working through that process of feedback and showing more ideas to figure out where that energy is lying and where they're most excited by. And so we kind of whittle down list by list until the right opportunities kind of sift to the top. And then we start putting things in order throughout the period of time that we're trying to plan for. And all these things are going to be kind of calibrated to their budget and geographic preferences and those kinds of things. So it is kind of like having just like a personal travel planner, but then there's also this mentorship component where I'm really helping work them through like engaging with what is it going to be like to be in a rural research site with like, electricity that comes on intermittently or storms or it's hard to get to or those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then we work on pre-departure preparation. I help get them ready to go out into the world. And then I'm kind of on hand if they have any issues that arise. And then on the back end, we do debriefing. We talk about transitioning to their next educational step or work step. And then kind of they're feeling supported throughout their experience, not just in the planning, but throughout the experience as well.
So are you in touch whilst they're out in the field or out, on site and sort of checking
Well,
in? Like what's the
I
contact
try
there?
to, yeah, I mean, like, in the background. So,
Yeah.
like, for example, I was just checking in with a student who's doing an elephant conservation project in northern Thailand. And he WhatsApped me a bunch of pictures the other day and he's like, it's amazing. And, it was amazing to hear from him. So sometimes
Yeah.
I'll hear from students with those kinds of like digital postcards. And other times I don't hear from a student for 3 months until they're back home. And then we have a debrief conversation. So it's kind of the individual gets to choose how much they interact with me. But if sometimes they'll text or email and say, hey, I actually want to extend my time in Southeast Asia. Do you have advice about traveling around or something like that? So I kind of like will swoop in as needed if they need anything.
Got you. Yeah. Sounds really valuable. How, well, how did you get into this line of work? Like, obviously, you have an interest and a background in this and the kind of travel elements. But yeah, as you say, it's a growing, emerging field that you're one of the few specialists in. Like, what's your background and how did you land in this particular place in your career?
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of a funny story. I took a gap year, but I took my gap year after uni. I graduated from college. I went to Hamilton College in New York State, and I really wanted to volunteer. So I actually found a British gap year organization. They're now called Restless Development, but at the time they're called Student Partnership Worldwide, and they did long-term placements in Africa and Asia, focused on public health. And so I went to Tanzania for almost a year. I had a cohort of 14 other international volunteers, and then we were matched in pairs with national volunteers and then kind of deployed to small rural communities to deliver health curriculum in the schools. And it was a really intense experience as far as it was super challenging. Had to learn Swahili, had to live in a low resource community, had to learn how to navigate very touchy and taboo, sexual reproductive health subjects with like these communities.
Yeah.
But I came away from it just totally changed from the experience. And not only that, but I got to see these British gap year students who were pre-university go through the same experience that I did and then get to start their university career. And I was so jealous because I thought, wow, my whole college experience would have been different if I had done this first. And so that really got the wheels turning for me. And so I got back from Tanzania. I moved out west to do I'm also a snowboarder, and that's a passion of mine. So I moved out west to figure out the next step while snowboarding. So I was living out in Jackson Hole, and I just kept on turning this over in my mind of, why don't Americans do this? We need to get Americans to do this. Like, college is so expensive and no one knows what they want to do and all of these things. And then that kind of just slowly emerged into, well, I could help people figure this out. I did it. Yeah. And so EnRoute started as a peer counseling organization. I was young enough that I was basically the same age as some of the gap year students I was working with. And then as I matured, it's kind of grown into more of this fully matured mentorship, travel planning, counseling business. But it started when I was, only about a year out of my own gap year.
That's amazing. Yeah. And what I see, you're an accredited counselor. Yeah. So what training have you had to be able to counsel people and support people in that way?
Yeah. So the accreditation process is through the Gap Year Association, which is the American governing body of the Gap Year movement. And they accredit counselors like myself, and they also accredit Gap Year programs. And they're an amazing resource. And so it's not so much training that's required, but it is a set of standards. Yep. So as part of my accreditation process, I had to have worked with a certain number of students. At the moment, I think you have to work with at least 125 gap year students, which is a huge barrier to entry. So you have to have basically a decent amount of experience before you're even eligible for accreditation. But then they also require you to submit how you vet programs and what does your counseling process look like? And what are you looking at as far as ethics and sustainability when it comes to advising your students, and how much are you in communication with your students? So there's all these benchmarks that you have to meet to be professionally accredited by GYA. And so there's Yeah, I think there's seven of us at the moment, maybe eight.
Mm.
And then there's a good number of people that are also professional gap year counselors, but are working towards accreditation as well. So yeah, it's small, but at the same time, it's a great community of my colleagues. I love they're all doing kind of everybody drives in kind of their own lane and has their own style, and it's a great group of people.
I love that. Yeah. And I guess as we sort of start to wrap up, like, would you like to share anything about what it's like to do your job, just from a kind of career jobby perspective? Like, what do you enjoy about your work? Are there any particular challenges you'd like to kind of share with our audience? Yeah. What's the kind
Yeah.
of honest, transparent view about what being a gap year counselor like yourself?
Yeah, well, I do love what I do. I have to admit, it is an amazing job because it marries a lot of my interests, because I do get so inspired by helping people find their path and getting them excited, especially when a student is coming to me and they're downtrodden or lost, or just like, I had the worst high school experience, or I don't know what I want in life, and then being able to reframe that as, hey, take this opportunity to figure that out. You don't need to know. But all you need is enthusiasm to discover the world, and a gap year can be the ticket.
Yeah.
So that helping students with that mindset shift is so fulfilling. But then the other thing I love is that I am a traveler myself. If I did not have a husband and children, I would probably be a nomad full time. I do love my family, and they come on my adventures with me very frequently, but I just love seeing new places. I love meeting people. I'm so inspired by people who I get to meet in the field who are doing the work. I was just in Costa Rica a month and a half ago, and I was visiting, turtle conservation centers and wildlife rehab centers and schools and all these other people. And the people that are doing this work are so passionate. So that always fills my cup. So the idea that I get to marry those two things in my work is amazing. I would say, like, the other side of it is that, one of the reasons why it's hard to get into this work, there's only, 7 professionally accredited counselors, is that we're still kind of fighting against the current of this pressure to send students straight to college in America. And so we're not seeing the amount of students taking gap time that I would like to see, that would create more opportunities for more people to get into gap year counseling, or not even get into gap year counseling, but just, offer more resources for students who are taking gap time. So right now we see somewhere between 3 and 4% of graduating high school seniors taking what we would define as a gap year. I would like to see that at 25 or 50%, and then I think it would be really interesting to see what would happen in higher ed if we had that many students taking intentional gap time with the intent to go to higher ed afterwards. So I would say that kind of like always feeling like I'm fighting the wave is a little bit, can be frustrating at times, but then people who actually do gap years are like, why doesn't everybody do this? Yeah. So it's kind of like finding out about a band before it gets big.
Yeah, I mean, where do you think gap years will be 20 years from now in the States? And North America more generally. You say it maybe started off more UK, European side. The tide has turned. It's come over your side and it's growing. I assume it's growing. Where do you think it's going to end up? Will it be closer to 20, 30, 40% of, university leavers, or where do you want it to be?
Yeah, it's such a good question. 20 years, so much can happen in 20 years. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I think is happening is that the higher education system in America is changing rapidly. Our demographics are changing, and therefore what people want out of higher education is changing. So we're seeing universities closing, and then these elite schools, having their admissions rates so low that they are crushing the spirits of so many young people who want to go to them and stuff. So and then there's this whole other group of young people who don't have plans to go to higher ed because they want to go get trained in a vocation. Or so what I would love to see in 20 years is there being full acceptance of every path. So right now we don't see as much encouragement about people going into the trades, even though that is a very well paid and stable career and amazing for people who learn experientially and want to do things with their hands. So I want to see people being fully encouraged and accepted to pursue their skill set, no matter what educational path that looks like. And I mean, kind of just getting rid of this whole elitism around higher ed and just thinking about like nurturing the whole person and helping usher people into adulthood with the skills and interests that they need to live full lives. So that's a really roundabout way to answer your question. But I think a gap year is going to be part of that. The name of it might change, how it looks might change, but I think that's what I would love to see, is more people using experiential education and intentional travel to figure out those next steps really intentionally.
Yeah, love it. It made me think, like, I wonder what we could rebrand a gap year as, because actually, in a way, the name doesn't help it. I think a little bit like gap feels pausey, brings that anxiety
Yeah.
about earlier. Impact year, or, I don't know,
Yeah,
development
there's
year,
been
or
some people have tried in the States to rebrand it. Some people call it bridge year,
yeah,
discovery year,
yeah.
exploration year. That's all great, but Google wants it to be gap year. That's what it that's
Yeah.
that's what it aggregates as. And so,
Yeah.
that's the term we have at the moment. That's why I try to like think of it as like the bridge over a gap, maybe, or you can
Yeah.
visualize it in different ways. But I think that part of that education and outreach is helping people understand what it truly is, so that they know that it is this powerful, on year, not an off year.
Yeah. And explaining what it is to people. I think you've done a
Mm.
fantastic job in that
Mm.
context. So yeah, thank you so much, Julia, for jumping on the
Thank
podcast. It's been
you.
such a pleasure talking to you, understanding more about your work. You shared some great advice as well for our audience who might be thinking about an experience, travel, or just hitting pause in their life career and working through a process about where they want to go and what they want to do. So yeah, it's been really great. If people want to find out more about you and particularly your services like EnRoute Consulting, like where should they go? Where should we send them?
Yeah, well, a good soft landing is any of my social media platforms, because I think that even if you just linger there, you'll learn stuff. I always try to post videos and information that's useful for everybody as like just a first stop. So I'm very active on Instagram and TikTok, and my handle is at EnRoute Gap Year.
Mhm.
I also am on Facebook and LinkedIn. You can find me there, same handles. And my website is enroutegapyear.com, and I'm very easy to find. So if you ever have questions or just want to reach out or give a follow, that's a great first step.
That's great. Okay. And we'll make sure we link it into the notes as well so people can kind
Oh,
of click off
perfect.
on
Yeah.
whatever's shown below here. Great.
Yeah.
Well, Julia, thank you again. It's been really great chatting. Great to connect.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. If you did, then please do hit the subscribe button to get notified of new episodes as they drop. And also, please give us a rating or a review, because it really helps us to get in front of more people, and we really enjoy reading them all. As you'll have heard, our podcasts are now recorded in front of a live audience who sit in and listen to the chat, and then after the mics are turned off, they get a chance to talk to the host, to share their thoughts, and also to ask questions. It's a really great format. If you'd like to be in the audience, all you need to do is join the Conservation Careers Academy. Now, in the Conservation Careers Academy, you'll get full access to the world's biggest conservation job board, listing over 15,000 jobs, volunteer and internships across the globe each year. You'll also enjoy access to our amazing CC Pro private members community with regular events, networking and support. Plus, you'll get full access to our growing library of career boosting resources, guides and templates. And best of all, it only costs a few dollars, euros or pounds per month to join the Academy. Now, to find out more, please visit conservation-careers.com/academy, or simply click the join button at the top of our website. See you on the inside.